A pregnant ex-convict woman found a wallet of a wealthy man by the grave, and when she looked inside, she couldn't believe her eyes. The June sun pleasantly warmed Megan's back as she walked along the rows of marble tombstones and memorials of various shapes and colors. A walk through the cemetery was by no means a pleasure for her, but it was a sad necessity without which Megan simply could not survive. She carefully inspected the graves, making sure not to disturb the relatives who had come to visit their deceased loved ones, looking for any candies, cookies, bread, and other edible items left behind. Some of the elderly homeless women sitting at the cemetery gates reproached Megan for collecting in such a way. "Watch out, Megan, you're going to get yourself into trouble among the dead. What's going to happen to your baby?" "This isn't good," said Sharon, an elderly beggar who had been living on the streets for many years. "Who knows what kind of things people do here at night? If some evil eye or curse falls on your child, you'll be left wondering why your son or daughter is screaming incessantly like they're possessed." However, Megan just waved off such warnings. "Oh, Sharon, I'm not afraid of curses anymore. After 3 years in prison, I've seen enough to scare away any witches or demons." Of course, the young woman was just putting on a brave face. If it weren't for her complete hopelessness and lack of a decent livelihood, she would never have set foot on this land of sorrow. But unfortunately, she had no other option for now. The thing was, the 28-year-old woman had been carrying a new life for almost 7 months. Megan had been released from the colony just 3 weeks ago on parole, and the child she was expecting was the result of her relationship with a young guard. Only now did the former inmate begin to realize that, if not for her pregnancy, she wouldn't have seen freedom for a very long time. The woman recalled the cold look the investigator had given her when she, pale and terribly exhausted after the stress of burying her husband, had been forced to go to him for questioning. "Megan Miller, we've received the results of the investigations," began the policeman in a dry, businesslike tone, "including the fingerprints our specialists collected at your home." "And," the woman asked weakly, "can you tell me what happened to my husband? Why did his heart stop so suddenly?" The investigator looked at her disdainfully, and the corner of his mouth twitched, making Megan feel as if he were laughing at her. "Don't you have any idea, do you?" the investigator replied with a question. "Well, fine. If you prefer to play the victim, I'll state the results specifically for you, so there are no more doubts that your husband was murdered." "What?" the young widow asked in shock. "What do you mean he was murdered? This is nonsense." "First of all, don't you dare raise your voice at me," the policeman barked, slamming his palm loudly on the smooth surface of the wooden table for added intimidation. "And secondly, don't pretend you don't understand. Your husband, Megan, was coldly poisoned. Moreover, we now know for sure that you did it, because the decanter that the victim drank from has only one set of fingerprints on it. And those fingerprints belong exclusively to you." Blood drained from Megan's face instantly. She felt her hands and feet growing cold, covered in tiny goosebumps. It became difficult for her to breathe, so she didn't answer immediately. It took her several painfully long seconds before she managed to say with pale lips, "That's impossible, no. I would never harm my husband. I love David." In response, the young widow heard the investigator's unpleasant, creaky, and hoarse laughter. "You know, Mrs. Miller, every second woman who has killed her husband says the same thing during interrogation. No one wants to admit to their actions right away. They all hope that there might have been some mistake in the investigation. But it's the truth," Megan insisted. "Why do you think I poisoned the water? Someone else who did this to my husband could have wiped the decanter. I only touched it after I entered David's office." A hint of irony appeared on the policeman's face. He leisurely jotted something down in his notebook and then fixed his unappealing, bird-like eyes back on her. "You must have wanted to take over David's apartment after his death," he continued nonchalantly. It seemed to him that her guilt was already a proven fact. "Well, I can understand you somewhat," the investigator shrugged. A huge 2-story apartment in an upscale residential complex, a respectable collection of paintings. Naturally, you thought there was no point in waiting for your husband to find a mistress and then push you aside. As a result, you wouldn't get a penny from the division of property. What nonsense, Megan couldn't hold back. How can you make such disgusting assumptions? I don't know anything about any mistress. My husband was a simple businessman. He sold furniture, not owned an oil rig. Yes, this apartment was indeed the most valuable thing he managed to acquire over the years, but he never mentioned divorce to me. And even if he had, David was a noble man. I'm sure he would never have treated me the way you're describing. Megan began to sob. Her black scarf was soaked through with the tears rolling down her face. The woman had come here straight from the funeral. The investigator, with undisguised disdain, tossed her a paper napkin. Wipe your tears. You're making a mess. Good Lord, all you women are natural actresses. The policeman shook his head and looked somewhere above Megan's head, toward the black, light-proof mirror. The young woman suspected he was being given some kind of signal from there. It seemed it was time to wrap things up with her. You decided, driven by greed and the natural female trait of wanting to secure your future, to take what was rightfully yours before the property division even began, the investigator concluded confidently. No, everything you're saying is completely fabricated, Megan maintained. And a heart attack is so convenient, the man pressed Megan, ignoring her words. But you made a mistake by choosing poison. The forensic expert immediately suspected something was off as soon as he saw the body. And now we're completely convinced. Megan shook her head negatively and firmly repeated. I didn't do it, I'm telling you again. I didn't kill my husband. And aren't you considering the possibility that it could have been one of his competitors? Don't you want to investigate that theory? The young widow felt a mix of anger and the weight of the injustice that had fallen upon her. Maybe you'd like to teach us how to do our job, the policeman snapped again. You just said your husband was almost a sofa salesman. Why would he have competitors capable of organizing an assassination? Doesn't that seem a bit small time? Not at that level. Megan pressed her lips together, her eyes reflecting resignation. It seemed everyone had already made their decision for her, and there appeared to be no hope for her escape. She didn't know what else to say in her defense, so the investigator's face broke into a satisfied smile. Take her away, he ordered the guard standing by the interrogation room door. I think everything is clear here. We're done. The police led the feebly resisting Megan away, and from that moment on, she never saw freedom again. First, she spent about a month in pretrial detention, and then a swift trial decided her fate. Megan was sentenced to 8 years in a general regime prison and was sent to a colony located far in the north. The woman did not know that her husband's parents, who were quite wealthy, hated their daughter-in-law so much that when their son's tragedy occurred, they didn't consider any other suspects. They were absolutely convinced that Megan was the only possible perpetrator. To be extra cautious, they also gave the investigators such a substantial bribe that he promised to do everything possible to steer the investigation in the direction favorable to David's parents. Life in the colony was very tough for Megan. It's well known that women serving sentences for killing their husbands often face attacks from their more authoritative fellow inmates. Megan was no exception, and she had to fight for every day of her life, or she would have been immediately trampled. One day, a young guard named Thomas Barnes was transferred to their prison. Despite the grim environment in which he worked, he made an effort to treat all the inmates with friendliness and understanding. Life has all kinds of situations, he would often say. Just being here and separated from their families is punishment enough for these women. Why make it worse for them? Thomas was just over 30 but had considerable wisdom for his age. He was liked by everyone, both the inmates and the staff of the colony. As a result, each woman secretly dreamed that this handsome guy with a very kind and pleasant face would take notice of her. Of course, Thomas maintained order to the same extent as the other guards, but he never treated the women harshly unless the situation required it according to his duties. Thomas was in charge of the sewing workshop where Megan worked. That's where they first saw each other. The quiet and modest woman immediately appealed to the guard, even though his colleagues warned him that he was dealing with someone who had sent her husband to the afterlife. However, Thomas didn't care and gradually began to court Megan. He would bring her small bouquets of wildflowers or leave a chocolate bar on her workbench. The head of the colony, seeing that a romance was developing between the inmate and the guard, reluctantly allowed them to occasionally meet in the visitation room. He had thoroughly studied Megan's case and had come to the disheartening conclusion that the young widow had been cleverly framed. As for Thomas, he had a spotless reputation and good judgment, so the head of the colony could trust him on this matter. "Be careful, Thomas," he warned his employee, "just in case. If you feel that she's trying to use you for her own interests, report it to me immediately. Understood? I hope this love of yours is genuine, but it's always best to stay vigilant. Do you agree?" The young man nodded. "Don't worry, Donald. Megan and I have discussed everything in advance. She knows what will happen if she tries to betray me. But she's not like that at all. I think we would make a very good family together." Thomas was not exaggerating. He truly evoked only the kindest and tenderest feelings in Megan. The inmate was grateful to have a real protector among the local scorpions. Many in the colony were displeased with the situation and even tried to frame Megan to separate her from the guard, but the young widow was not easily intimidated. She had learned to stand up for her right to live and love, and she strived to maintain her dignity among envious inmates and guards. Thomas quietly helped her in any way he could, and then, once when they were alone, he proposed to her. Megan felt warmth and tenderness spread through her heart. She could never have imagined their relationship reaching this exciting moment. "You'll see, Megan," he told her, "as soon as we're married, we'll leave this place far, far away. I work here on a contract too." "Oh, Thomas, you silly," Megan replied with a sad smile. "Do you even know how long I have left here? They gave me 8 years. God, I just hope to make it through." Thomas lovingly squeezed his fiancée's fingers. "You might not have to serve the full term. You can apply for parole, and I'm sure they'll grant it. Then we'll try to start a new life together." Megan didn't know why, but she desperately wanted to believe the guard's words. She had lost hope of ever finding happiness again. Yes, she loved David, but he, truthfully, never showed his feelings fully. They lived well together, but his parents, as Megan knew, didn't like her at all, even though they tried to keep their composure for their son whenever they visited. Thomas was entirely different. It was as if he was made from the same stuff as Megan, and she didn't have to prove she deserved to be called a businessman's wife. He was an ordinary man, yet the kindest, most honest, and reliable man she had ever met in her life. However, the young widow's dreams were not destined to come true. In the 4th year of Megan's imprisonment, Thomas was brutally killed by other inmates. It remained unclear whether this was related to personal grudges or if the women sought to take revenge on Megan for her happiness. Upon hearing of her beloved's death, Megan felt like she was going to go mad. The pain in her heart was more intense than even after the death of her first husband. "Why, Lord? Why is this happening to me?" Megan asked the heavens. "Will I now carry this curse for the rest of my life? No man survives next to me." Overwhelmed by grief, Megan considered taking her own life, but thank God, compassionate cellmates, whom she could trust, saved her. Later, during a mandatory medical examination, she learned that she was pregnant. At first, the news brought her mixed feelings. How would she manage here now? And when the baby was born, would they take it away? Fortunately, pregnancy within the walls of the colony was a basis for parole. Since the head of the colony was aware of Megan and Thomas's relationship, he had no problem processing all the necessary documents for the expectant mother. And so Megan was released. Now, it was crucial for her to figure out what to do next, how to start her life anew. She no longer had any friends. The few she had during her marriage to David turned their backs on her as soon as they learned of Megan's arrest. The former inmate also had no parents, as they had died many years earlier, just before she decided to move to the city. Megan was from a remote village where she had spent most of her childhood and youth. Her mother worked on the local farm, managing the planting of feed crops for the livestock, and her father worked as a combine harvester. Megan, like her parents, planned to work on the farm after school and even completed special veterinary courses. She hoped to treat sick animals, thus helping them end the entire farming operation. However, life, as it often does, abruptly changed all her plans. One winter, when Megan was just over 20, her mother and father contracted a severe form of influenza and, unfortunately, could not recover. They sought medical help too late, despite Megan's pleas to speed up the process. The daughter was devastated. It was only by a miracle that she did not contract the illness herself, but she felt no joy from that. Her parents died within a week, and it was the blow that drove the young woman to gather her belongings and move to the city. Almost immediately after the funeral, Megan sold the house. Once the deal was done, she left the village and closed the door on that tragic part of her past forever. In the city, she worked for a while at a private veterinary clinic, where she met David, her future husband. The businessman brought his small black pug, Henry, for treatment, and from that moment, a pleasant acquaintance began between them, which later smoothly evolved into a calm romance and eventually into marriage. Now, Megan had nothing left to hold onto as she tried to reintegrate into society. The pregnant woman could not secure any decent job, as all employers suspected she wanted to join their company solely for maternity leave. Moreover, her prison release certificate had a negative impact on their perception. No one wanted to associate with a former inmate, and the mark of being an ex-convict now seemed to be permanently branded on her forehead. Due to not having her own housing, she had to spend the first period sleeping on the streets. Later, Megan learned about special crisis centers for women in difficult life situations. There, she could be fed and always allowed to stay for a few days to rest and get herself back in order. Megan didn't abuse the help she received from the crisis centers, trying to use it only in exceptional cases. Nevertheless, she needed to start adapting to life outside, so she decided to collect various kinds of food from the cemetery. It wasn't as humiliating as begging, for instance. The former inmate even mapped out a route through the cemetery, knowing where the richest graves were located. There, she could always find prepared meals or sweets. Each time she retrieved something tasty, Megan would invariably remember the person resting beneath the ground. Whether the deceased was a criminal, a gypsy baron, or just a wealthy person who had died in a car accident or from a cruel illness, Megan simply thanked the deceased for ensuring that she and her unborn child did not die of hunger that day. Passing by one of the graves, Megan noticed a large leather wallet lying under a bench next to the headstone. Joyful thoughts immediately sprang to her mind, and her mood lifted. Such luck was rare lately for the former convict, so finding a lost wallet meant she could secure food for a few days at least. Looking around to make sure no one was nearby, she picked up the wallet from the damp ground and, holding her breath, slowly opened it. Unfortunately, anticipation turned into sharp disappointment. There was almost no money inside. Mostly, it contained various bank cards and some receipts. Sighing, Megan was about to close the wallet when she noticed a corner of a driver's license peeking out from a separate compartment. Pulling it out, the young pregnant woman saw a color photo and realized that the face looked familiar. Mark Hansen, she read the name of the wallet's owner and then gasped. Looking at the headstone next to which she found the wallet, Megan initially thought she was mistaken. But no, the name and surname on the license perfectly matched the name of the deceased on the marble monument. How strange, Lord, Megan thought to herself. If Mark was buried a year ago, then how could his wallet be here? Surely the deceased didn't just drop it. This is odd, Megan said aloud, inspecting the find once more. Indeed, the wallet was almost new. It couldn't have been lying out in the open for so long. Either someone would have picked it up, or the money inside would have been ruined by snow and moisture, turning to mush like the car license. The receipts, like the banknotes, were completely dry, as if they had been issued just a few hours ago. Everything seemed very unusual to Megan. Hiding the wallet in the pocket of her old jacket, she pondered what to do next. There was only a small amount of money, which she would obviously spend. But what about the cards? She couldn't withdraw anything from them. And trying to use them in a store, even for a small purchase, could lead to a new arrest. Megan didn't want to end up in prison again, so she decided not to take risks and leave everything in the wallet as it was. However, from that moment on, the young woman began to visit the mysterious grave more frequently. Megan hoped to see someone from the deceased's family. And one day, she got lucky. Seeing a man sitting on the bench in front of the headstone, Megan quietly approached him and asked, "Excuse me, are you by any chance related to the deceased?" The stranger, who was sitting with his back to Megan, turned around, and Megan felt as if she'd been struck by lightning. Despite his thick beard and mustache, he was the very same person whose photo Megan had found in the ill-fated wallet. Oh my God, the pregnant woman clutched her stomach. The shock triggered false labor pains, but Megan was so frightened by the prospect of giving birth in the cemetery prematurely that she chose to sit on a bench by a nearby grave. The future mother shut her eyes tightly and began to breathe deeply, trying to calm the severe cramp in her lower abdomen. 1, 2, 3, 4, she tried to count while stroking her stomach. "Miss, are you all right?" The supposed deceased rushed over to her and began to comfortingly pat her shoulders. You're buried there," Megan managed to say with difficulty, pointing to the headstone. The man followed her gaze and replied tersely, "Yes, but it's not what you think. I am very much alive, you can be assured of that. Calm down, nothing terrible is happening. I'll explain everything to you." Once the contractions subsided and Megan began to feel better, the bearded stranger began his story. "I had to stage my own death because I had no other choice. Someone wants to kill me." Megan looked at the man with wide eyes. "Kill you? But who?" "My stepmother and half-brother," Mark explained. "After my father's death, they sensed the financial opportunity and decided to take over all of Dad's assets by eliminating me first. Even though I was adopted, my father always considered me his own. Besides, I am 3 years older than Carl. I am turning 35 this year, which means all the management of my father's company should have passed to me." "My goodness," Megan said, "what terrible people." "Tell me about it," Mark nodded. "It's a real conspiracy. It all started when Sandra bribed one of the drivers and had my car's braking system tampered with. I was in a terrible accident, but miraculously managed to crawl out of the car before it exploded." Megan pressed her hands to her face and whispered, "Oh my God." "But that wasn't the end," Mark continued calmly. "The next time I was attacked in a dark alley near my office. The assailant stabbed me twice with a knife." To prove the truth of his words, the man lifted his shirt and showed Megan 2 long, rough scars, just a few centimeters from his heart. "Thank God for that," he commented briefly. Megan could only gasp softly. This was something she definitely hadn't expected to see. "You're a real lucky person," she said. "You must have been born under a lucky star." "I hope my father is still watching over me from up there," Mark said, nodding towards the sky. "Otherwise, I would have been buried long ago." The young businessman pointed to his own headstone. "I didn't wait for a third attempt. I staged it so that my car would fall into a river from a bridge while I was on my way to finalize an important deal. Of course, I had to pay a lot for fake testimony and a car inspection, but the main thing is that my trick worked. Sandra and Carl, my stepmother and brother, think I'm dead. That will keep them off guard for a while until I figure out what to do next." Mark smiled at Megan with a hint of sadness. "So don't worry, there's no one in that coffin. I'm as alive as ever." Megan hesitated for a moment, then decided to return the wallet to its rightful owner. "I'm sorry, when I found it, I immediately thought something was wrong. How could the same person be on the driver's license and in this grave? So I decided to keep an eye on the grave." "I'm sorry." "It's all right," Mark simply replied and gratefully accepted the wallet. "I come here just for the sake of it. For my own whim. I look at myself and think, if it had been a little different, I would actually be there. It helps me get up every day with the thought that I must seek justice and not let my relatives take over my father's business. Megan looked at Mark intently, then nodded sympathetically. I understand, believe me. But is there any way to hold them accountable? Mark shook his head sadly in response. Evidence. It's very hard to come by because all the evidence against Sandra and Carl is only circumstantial. That pair isn't the dumbest. They've covered their tracks everywhere, just to avoid suspicion. Megan understood the young businessman's feelings very well. She had recently faced similar injustice, where for the sake of money and general animosity, a person could be literally locked away, erasing any trace of them from life. David, her husband, also had financial assets. His company was considered quite successful. He had told her shortly before his death that the company had finally started to turn a good profit. Then he was poisoned, and all the blame was placed on her. What happened to all the money and assets of the company remained an unsolved mystery for Megan. But the young woman assumed that David's parents had taken care of it, unwilling to share anything with their daughter-in-law. Megan told Mark her story, and he listened with genuine sympathy and understanding. Suddenly, a strange, slightly mischievous glint appeared in his eyes. Megan, what if I offer you a job where you could earn good money? How would you feel about that? Megan became a bit wary. It depends on what it is. The businessman smiled. Don't worry. Nothing criminal. I will pay you, and you will help me press my brother and stepmother. How can I help you with that? Megan didn't understand. I have no connection to your family. Mark shook his head. Your task would be to infiltrate my stepmother's house as a maid and gather some compromising material on them and my brother. I know they have documents in their safe. There might even be photos that could be considered direct evidence of their guilt. I can't say this for sure, but I have a feeling that my father didn't die of natural causes either. Megan looked at the man in astonishment and nodded slowly. All right. But even if I go to them and say I want to work there, it's not a given that they will hire a pregnant woman in her 7th month. If you set the lowest price for yourself, they will gladly hire you, Mark reassured her. I've checked, their previous maid just quit. They are very greedy people. They're not willing to pay much, so their staff keeps leaving. After careful consideration, Megan agreed. She had nothing to lose, and it would provide her with shelter and food. Plus, she would be able to help a good person. She could still work, so she hoped that Mark's relatives would accept her into their home without asking too many questions. The young woman had no intention of revealing her criminal record. Upon arriving at the given address, Megan found herself in front of a large 2-story house, surrounded by a tall stone wall on all sides. After explaining to the security guard the purpose of her visit, she was escorted inside and led to Sandra's office, Mark's stepmother. Sandra, a tall, thin woman in her early 40s, seemed to look everywhere but directly at Megan during their conversation. The way she spoke made the young pregnant woman feel an overwhelming urge to leave as quickly as possible, so haughty was the mistress of the grand estate. But Megan remembered her promise to Mark. So she had no choice but to endure the icy demeanor of her new acquaintance's stepmother. Are you sure you can adhere to all the rules of my house? Sandra asked at the end of the interview. Keep in mind, I have no desire to pay for idle hands. Moreover, you will not be allowed to leave the mansion more than once a week. Is that acceptable to you? Sandra then looked Megan straight in the eyes, and the poor pregnant woman felt an unpleasant shiver spread through her body. The rich widow's black eyes reminded her of a poisonous snake. One wrong word or objection, and their entire plan with Mark could go awry. Yes, Megan quickly replied, yes, that's perfectly fine. I don't have any relatives in the city anyway, so. Well, that's excellent, Sandra said, as if she were pronouncing each word with precision. I am not interested in the details of your personal life, so starting tomorrow you can begin your duties. And remember, if either I or my son believe you are behaving incompetently or performing poorly, Sandra once again gave Megan a piercing look, you'll be out of here faster than I can tell my dog attack. Is that clear? Megan blinked her big, light eyes in confusion. Was this termagant really ready to set her watchdogs on maids for mere disobedience? Out loud, she could only manage to say, "Of course, absolutely, Miss Sandra. I promise to work quietly and diligently, just as you wish." The housekeeper nodded, and the security guard, who had been standing by the door all this time, led the young woman to the head maid, who explained in detail what Megan's tasks would be in the mansion. Gray workdays stretched out before Megan. Mark was right in saying that his stepmother and half-brother had terrible tempers. They scrutinized the entire staff with suspicion, constantly suspecting them of idleness or laziness. Megan heard Sandra several times berate other maids with undisguised pleasure, but so far, everyone was satisfied with her work. Carl Hansen turned out to be a charming but very slippery young man who enjoyed good drinks but didn't like to work much. Time and again, his mother would scold him for his unmet business obligations, but he only brushed her off with jokes. It seemed he didn't pay much regard to his mother's authority. "Mom, calm down, please. The company isn't going anywhere. We'll let them stew for another week, and they'll bring all the contracts to us for signing. They'll lay it all out on a silver platter. They can't afford to lose such huge percentages." "Carl, get yourself together already," Sandra retorted fiercely. "I told you clearly, you need to be very careful with these partners. They're not as straightforward as they want to seem. And they're working with the Chinese as well. The situation could change at any moment, and then we'd be left with a huge loss. Honestly, sometimes I think you care about nothing but your parties and endless alcohol." Instead of responding, the young man triumphantly raised his whiskey glass, which he hadn't put down during their conversation. "Luckily, Daddy left us plenty of money," Carl said dreamily. "So what if we lose a bit on this deal? Another one will come up. The important thing is that we're now endlessly rich, Mom, and nobody keeps track of our expenses anymore." Carl took a sip of his drink, and his mother's face twisted with disgust. "My God, how pathetic you are," she said slowly. "At least have some shame drinking in front of your mother. It's not even noon yet." The son replied something unpleasant to Sandra, followed by the distinct sound of a slap. It seemed that Mark's stepmother's composure had finally cracked. Quite a family, Megan thought to herself as she diligently polished the antique bronze figurines on the large oak dresser. They seemed to care about nothing but money. The son would probably sell his own mother if promised a decent sum. Otherwise, if not for such unpleasant scenes, the stepmother and her son treated Megan quite reasonably. Maybe it was because she was pregnant, or perhaps because she gave them no reason to complain. They didn't mistreat Megan, but they never praised her either, believing that if the maid's work was done to the highest standard, that was how it should be. When Megan received her salary after a month, she didn't know how to react. The amount was so modest that the pregnant maid certainly hadn't expected to see it. She had, of course, stated the minimum salary she was willing to accept when she was hired, as Mark had instructed, but she had hoped the employers would have some remaining sense of fairness. It turned out they did not. Fortunately, Mark had transferred a good sum of money to the account Megan had opened for this purpose. Thanks to this, Megan was able to buy necessary vitamins and fruits for the first time during her pregnancy. The man had kept his promise and now expected the same from Megan. However, Megan had nothing to offer the young businessman yet. During the month she had worked at Mark's stepmother's house, Megan had noticed an interesting person. It was a young woman, beautiful and cheerful, with a cascade of golden hair that flowed down her slender back to her waist. The girl was named Betty, and she was known to be Carl's fiancée. Megan had noticed that the young man often argued with his mother because of her. The new girlfriend of the son was vying for the position of his wife, which greatly displeased Sandra, who had planned to find a much more advantageous and aristocratic match for her Carl. Carl himself was very determined and had even given his lover a magnificent, ridiculously expensive ring with a huge pink diamond. When his mother found out about this misappropriation of parental funds, Carl had apparently taken the money from a special account set up by his father. She exploded, creating a real scandal for her son. The most unpleasant part was that Betty was also present in the house during the argument and could clearly hear the future mother-in-law berating her fiancé and herself. "I can't believe you decided to marry this tramp. Look at her closely. All she dreams about is getting closer to your money," Sandra yelled at her son, shaking her fists in the air. "What do you know about Betty, Mom?" Carl yelled back. "She's the most beautiful, intelligent, and charming girl I've ever known. We're definitely getting married in a couple of months, and you're not going to stop us." "Over my dead body," the mistress of the mansion shouted back and quickly left the house, unwilling to continue the argument. On the threshold, she paused briefly and, turning back, shouted at her son, waving her miniature designer handbag in the air. "Listen to me, Carl. If I find out that you're marrying this trash, I will disinherit you completely, do you hear?" "Just try it, old witch," the son retorted in the same spiteful manner. "Your trick won't work a second time. I'm not like your father. I won't let myself." The young man stopped abruptly when he saw several members of the household staff, including the housekeeper, the cook, and Megan, watching him with undisguised curiosity. "What are you staring at, you lot?" he growled at them. "Do you want me to fire everyone? Get back to work, or I'll throw you all out." The workers immediately lowered their eyes in embarrassment and hurried to their tasks. Megan noticed red spots appearing on the young master's face as soon as he recalled his father. The woman realized there was an unpleasant secret hidden here, possibly related to the documents she was supposed to find. But at that moment, someone called out to the girl softly. She turned and saw Betty, Carl's fiancée, standing before her. The blonde, with a slight smirk, approached Megan almost up close and pointed to the young woman's protruding belly that was visible under her uniform. "Isn't it harmful for the baby to hear such conversations?" she almost sang. "By the way, a eavesdropping maid is the most vulgar and unattractive thing that can exist in a respectable household. What are you snooping around for, I wonder?" Megan looked into Betty's beautiful dark green eyes and didn't know how to respond. At that moment, the pregnant woman realized that the girl's face seemed familiar, but she couldn't recall where she had seen it before. "No, not at all. I wasn't eavesdropping," the maid finally replied. "Sandra asked me to clean the lower hall, so I came down." Betty scrutinized her with a suspicious look and, continuing to smirk, added, Well, fine. Just keep cleaning, maid, or I'll tell my fiancé everything, and then you'll find yourself out on the street along with your little brat. And that's in the best-case scenario." The girl looked at her in a way that left Megan with no doubt that this beauty would be a fitting addition to the family of the local wealthy vampires. A few days later, Luck smiled on the young woman. While cleaning Carl's office, she noticed that the small safe where all the important documents were kept was open, as its owner had left for somewhere. Without wasting any time, Megan peeked inside and quickly photographed all the documents she could grab with her phone. Among other things, she found 2 death certificates, both from Mark's father, but the conclusions in them were completely different. "Oh my God," Megan whispered to herself, "he was right." As soon as the girl finished taking photos, Carl stumbled into the office, arm in arm with his lover. Megan barely had time to grab a broom and retreat to the large bookcase. She then pretended to scrub away some dirt on one of its shelves. The lovers, however, seemed not to notice the maid at all. They were passionately kissing and hugging. Then, to Megan's great astonishment and embarrassment, Carl lifted Betty into his arms and placed her on the wide desk, continuing to shower her face and neck with kisses. Megan didn't know what to do. She would have gladly wanted to disappear through the floor, but she feared that trying to leave openly would only provoke more anger from the young rich man. At that moment, she heard Betty passionately speak to her fiancé. "Do you have any wine, Carl? Let's drink and celebrate our engagement without that snake, your mommy." Instead of defending his mother, Carl only laughed maliciously and joyfully. It seemed he shared the same opinion of Sandra, or perhaps it was Betty who had turned him against his mother. "Of course, darling. I'll get a bottle right away, and you take the glasses," Carl said. Megan pressed her face against the bookcase, hoping not to be noticed. Betty, retrieving the glasses from the cupboard, quickly glanced around. At that moment, the maid accidentally looked up and saw in the mirror of the glass door how the rich girl poured some white powder into Carl's glass. "Let me pour it for you," the beauty purred, distracting Carl from the bottle and quickly filling the glass with alcohol, almost to the brim. She then handed the glass to her fiancé with a burning, passionate smile. "Here you go," she said, keeping her gaze fixed on Carl. "I want us to drink this to the last drop." Betty took the wine from Carl's hands. "To our love," Carl whispered into her lips. "Nothing and no one will ever separate us. Until death." "Until death," Betty echoed and brought the poisoned drink to his lips. At that moment, a flash of realization struck Megan. She remembered where she had seen Betty before. Once, long ago, she had arrived at her husband David's office and saw a beautiful blonde girl at the reception. That was Betty. The beauty had worked as David's secretary and, apparently, was also involved in such dark dealings. She deceived wealthy men and then, extracting substantial amounts of money from them, eliminated them. Although Carl was extremely unpleasant to Megan, he did not deserve such a terrible death. Turning sharply, Megan threw the dusting cloth she had been using at Betty. When the scheming beauty momentarily lost her focus in her indignation, Megan swiftly knocked the cursed glass from her hands. "Don't drink," she breathed to Carl. "Don't drink anything she gives you, or you'll die." Carl stared at her with astonished eyes, while Betty looked at the pregnant maid with undisguised hatred. She seemed ready to scorch Megan with a look, but instead threw herself on Carl's shoulder and, with a tearful voice, said, "Carl, I'm scared. Who is this mad woman?" Megan was struck by how quickly the malice and rage on Betty's face turned into fear and feigned adoration for her wealthy fiancé. Mark's stepbrother continued to glare at the maid, his expression now showing open disdain and frustration. "What was that just now?" Carl asked sternly, addressing the pregnant maid. "How do you explain your actions?" "There was poison in the glass," Megan quickly replied. "I saw her put it in there while you were getting the wine. This girl intended to poison you." "What?" Carl exclaimed. "Are you out of your mind? Betty and I are engaged. She's my fiancée. What possible reason would she have to poison me?" The young wealthy man looked at Betty with hope. A shadow of panic crossed Betty's face, but she then only gave a crooked smile and indignantly said, "What nonsense! You're not actually going to believe this, are you, darling? She's just jealous of our strong feelings and our love. Her boyfriend probably dumped her as soon as he found out she was going to be a mother." Betty smiled brazenly and looked towards the maid as if challenging her to respond. Although deeply hurt, Megan knew she couldn't back down. Her sense of justice was stronger. She straightened up and looked fearlessly into the eyes of both Carl and his villainous fiancé. "You have no idea who you are tying your life to, Mr. Hanson," she said with an icy voice. "This woman may be responsible for my husband's death and for the fact that my own life has been shattered forever." Megan then told Carl how she had been falsely accused of her husband's death, imprisoned, and how she now had to work tirelessly just to ensure that she and her unborn child had food and a warm, dry bed, rather than sleeping on the streets. Hearing all this, Mark's stepbrother was deeply shocked. Turning slowly to his lover, he asked, "Betty, is this true? Did you really intend to kill me?" The blonde's lips trembled. She began to fussily stroke Carl's arm while her eyes darted around anxiously. "Oh, Carl, no. Of course not. She must have misunderstood something, that's why she's all worked up. She's pregnant, you know, hormones and all that. Are you really going to believe some maid over me, your one and only Betty? Your love, Carl." Carl stared at Betty silently, but his eyes were far from affectionate and loving. It was hard to believe, but Carl had finally recognized the lies in his beautiful fiancée's words. If all this isn't true, then why are you so concerned, Betty? Are you afraid that this woman will tell the police everything? Betty slowly backed away toward the wall while Carl loomed over her like a Shakespearean Moor. Admit it, did you want to poison me? Suddenly, Carl slammed his fist into the wall next to the beauty, his knuckles coming within inches of her face, causing Betty to shriek in fear. Yes, I wanted to do it, she squeaked, sounding like a mouse caught in a trap. In the glazed eyes of the young wealthy man, only one question was visible. Why? For what, Betty? I would have given you everything you wanted. Betty, whose eyes were filled with terror and tears, literally dropped to her knees in front of Carl and began to beg him. Carl, darling. Please forgive me. I was so foolish. But nothing happened, right? We were so happy together. Are you really going to ruin everything over some stupid misunderstanding? She clung to his hand with all her might. But when the young man turned away, Megan saw only disgust and pain on his face. It seemed he really had strong feelings for this poisoner and wasn't ready to accept that she had simply used him for her own selfish purposes. Get out, he said quietly, brushing her hands away as if she were just an annoying insect. Get out of my house, and I never want to see you again. The beauty struggled to get up from her knees, stumbling in her high heels. Her face, smeared with makeup, no longer looked so alluring and beautiful. Giving him one last look, Betty ran out of the room, and Megan heard the clacking of her stilettos as she descended the stairs to the first floor. The vile woman had fled, but Megan still felt a nasty sensation in her gut. She felt that this girl might be responsible for her husband's death. However, Megan had no concrete evidence, only indirect signs of guilt, which was even more distressing. Thank you for opening my eyes, Carl said. This girl completely captivated me. I followed her around as if under a spell. You're welcome, Megan responded, wincing involuntarily. She felt the baby inside her give a nudge. 8 months was indeed a significant time. Seeing that the maid looked unwell, the young wealthy man allowed her to rest in her room for a while before continuing her work. That was the extent of his gratitude. A week after the incident with Betty, Carl's demeanor hadn't changed. The financial situation also remained the same. Soon enough, the young wealthy man resumed his haughty behavior, claiming to his mother that he had broken up with his lover. Sandra was pleased, though she didn't show it. From then on, she managed to immerse her son in the company's affairs for a while. Megan continued to think about how she had, in essence, saved yet another scoundrel, as the Hanson family's greed had not dissipated. It seemed that Carl had survived the failed poisoning attempt like a bad dream, shaken himself off, and returned to his usual way of life. A few days later, Megan had another day off. She and Mark had arranged to meet at the same place as last time, at the cemetery, beside the young businessman's empty grave. Mark thought it would be safer for everyone this way, and Megan had no objections. After all, she needed to consider more than just herself. When the maid handed over all the photos she had taken in the office of his stepbrother and told him about the incident with Betty, Mark was quite surprised. Who would have thought our affairs would be so unexpectedly intertwined? He shook his head, then promised Megan, "Don't worry, we will definitely hold this murderer accountable. Who knows, if she was working for your husband, she might be the one who visited him shortly before his death." You say all of your husband's money disappeared after you were imprisoned? That's right, the woman nodded. I specifically asked my second fiancé, the guard. He promised to check everything through his contacts in economic law. They assured me that my husband's company seemed to have vanished overnight, dissolved. All the accounts were empty. Mark promised to look into the matter and, after carefully examining the photographs of the documents, noted the 2 different death certificates for his father. You know, Megan, he finally said, if it weren't for you, I would never have been able to prove the relatives' involvement in my father's death. Thank you for your help. I think it's time for me to come out of the shadows. I hope everything goes well for you, Mark. Megan wished him luck. These people deserve to face the law. While I was working for them, I became convinced that they would go to any lengths for their own gain. Mark printed out the photographs of the documents as evidence and went to the police to explain his situation in detail. The investigators were indeed shocked by such a dramatic turn in a long-closed case, but agreed to help the young businessman. Moreover, thanks to the information about Betty, they had a lead in another very delicate case. The next day, Mark, freshly shaved and groomed in a brand new business suit, drove up to his stepmother's house in his gleaming car. The guards, seeing the return from the dead man, nearly fainted. However, Mark managed to convince them that he was very much alive and needed to urgently speak with Sandra and Carl. The thin woman in the emerald three-piece suit, sitting at her desk at that moment, thought she must have misheard when she was informed about the visitor. Sandra assumed it must be some lunatic trying to profit from her family's scandalous past. The fact is, the news of the death of the Hanson family patriarch had caused a huge stir in the local press, making Sandra and her sons fend off persistent journalists. Mark didn't wait for a formal invitation. He quickly bypassed the guards and went up to the second floor. With a strong shove, he opened the door and came face to face with his scheming stepmother. Sandra paled when she saw her long-dead stepson and immediately clutched her heart. "This can't be, Mark," the woman said, breathing heavily. "You're dead. You crashed in that bridge accident. We saw the wreckage of your car." Mark, calmly ignoring his stepmother's emotions, said with a stone face, "And good morning to you too, Mother. So, have you and Carl already spent all of Dad's money, or is there still something left in those accounts you've been so diligently setting up in offshore zones and Cyprus over the past year?" The mention of money snapped Sandra back to her senses, and she quickly replaced her face with her usual icy mask. Mark had to give her credit. She maintained her composure splendidly, despite the rot of her greedy, cruel nature. "It's nice to know you're still so concerned about your father's affairs," Sandra said slowly, rising from her desk. "If only you knew how sometimes I regret that my real son isn't you, but that good-for-nothing Carl." Mark silently pulled documents from his bag and threw them onto the desk in front of her. "The game is over, Mother. Here's everything needed to prove your involvement in Dad's death, including the real death certificate, which shows that Dad didn't die of a heart attack. You injected him with too large a dose of the medication the doctor prescribed. You knew the overdose would cause a sudden heart failure. Then you bribed the pathologist to produce a false report. Am I right? Only Carl, the fool, never managed to part with the original. He was always too emotional and unstable. He even managed to get involved with the woman who tried to poison him." Sandra's face, which had remained impassive until then, twitched when she heard about her own son. "What? Poisoning?" She looked at her stepson in confusion, but at that moment, Carl himself entered the office. The young man, with his eyes wide with terror, stared at his supposedly deceased half-brother. Finally, he managed to shift his gaze to his mother, asking with difficulty, "Mom, am I imagining things? Is this really Mark?" "No, son. You're not imagining things," the mother replied tersely. "Your brother is intent on sending us to jail over some damn papers whose authenticity still needs to be proven. And what's this nonsense about poisoning he just told me?" Carl was confused, not knowing how to respond or how to react to the appearance of his half-brother, whom they had all thought was dead for a year. However, Mark resolved this dilemma himself. Brushing off the collar of his suit jacket, the young businessman glanced at his watch, and at that moment, the roar of police sirens could be heard in the estate's courtyard. "Oh, here come the police," he said with a smile. "I think they'll be very interested to hear about our father, and how you two tried to kill me twice, and of course, your countless financial schemes." Carl, with a loud scream, attempted to attack Mark, but he managed to deflect the assault just in time. Meanwhile, Sandra pulled a gun from the bottom drawer of her desk and aimed it directly at her stepson. "You should have done this 2 years ago, when we all went to Dubai. One tiny misstep on the roof of that mall, and you'd be truly feeding worms in a grave." Sandra pulled the trigger, and a loud gunshot echoed through the room. Mark barely managed to duck, which couldn't be said for Carl. "Mom," came Carl's weak sigh as he slowly crumpled to the floor. "No," Sandra screamed in anguish. "Carl, my son, no." The woman rushed to her son, but upon falling to her knees, she saw armed police officers entering the room. "Well, we have a lot to discuss, Sandra Hansen," said the detective, looking at her and her injured son in surprise. The officer brought the radio to his lips and spoke loudly. "Ambulance to 42nd Street, quickly. House 22. Gunshot wound to the shoulder. Suspect alive, but appears to have lost a lot of blood." A few minutes later, steel handcuffs clicked onto the sorrowful businesswoman's wrists. "Don't think I'll be sitting there for long, Mark," she sneered at her stepson. "I have very good lawyers. Thankfully, your daddy made sure that his family always had insurance for such occasions." "I don't think so," Mark replied calmly. "I've already called them, and they assured me they won't be assisting the murderers of my father. Besides, we're no longer family, Sandra. So the most you can hope for is public defense, which, as I've heard, isn't very effective." Sandra growled in frustration before the police led her away and put her in a patrol car. The ambulance, arriving shortly thereafter, took Carl away on a stretcher. The doctors had to extract the bullet left by his own mother and then hand him over to the authorities. During the investigation, it was discovered that Sandra's phone contained deleted messages in a secret chat. There, she and her son had arranged both the attempt on her stepson's life in the alley and the tampering with the brake line of his car. All this was done through a less than reputable driver whom Mark's father had fired before his sudden death. Additionally, a knife with the driver's fingerprints, found in Sandra's safe, was expected to ensure a long prison term for Sandra and her accomplice. Although Carl admitted he kept documents and evidence in the safe to turn his mother in if she tried to leave him penniless and become the sole heir. As for Betty, she was also apprehended. The police arrived just in time as the beauty was preparing to flee the country. She was caught at the airport. During interrogation, it was revealed that Betty had been a so-called serial poisoner for a long time. As Mark and Megan suspected, she had committed several other crimes besides attempting to murder Carl. Unfortunately, businessman David Miller was among her victims. Betty ingratiated herself with men, often becoming their lover or, as in Carl's case, their fiancé, then poisoned them with a powerful toxin previously obtained from her chemist brother. Furthermore, her brother, who was also her accomplice in all her schemes, helped Betty transfer all the stolen money to safe Swiss accounts, making it nearly impossible to trace the funds. Now, like Sandra and Carl, Betty would face justice and spend the rest of her life not in luxury as she had hoped, but in a cramped prison cell. When the truth about Betty emerged, Mark did everything possible to rehabilitate the pregnant Megan. The young businessman ensured that all charges against her were dropped, and her reputation was restored to its former glory. Words cannot express how happy Megan was to learn that she no longer had to live with the stigma of a convict. She thanked Mark in every way she could. Megan continued to work for Mark in his home and helped with household chores until it was time for her to give birth. Unfortunately, as Megan had no access to ultrasound in prison, she was unaware until the very last moment that she was expecting twins. The birth was very difficult, but Megan managed to bring two wonderful boys into the world. The young mother named them William and John, in honor of her grandfathers on both sides. Mark was pleased to look after the new mother while she recovered in the hospital and happily brought everything needed for her and the babies. One day, just before her discharge, Mark noticed that both boys had unusual moles on the right side of their bodies. He had an identical mole on his own body, exactly the same shape and size. He realized that this couldn't be a mere coincidence. Such things are passed down through generations. Therefore, he decided to risk asking Megan about it. "What was your second fiancé's name?" "The one who worked as a guard in the prison?" "Thomas," Megan replied, surprised. "Why do you ask?" "Megan, I know this might sound strange," Mark began, embarrassed, "but let me perform a genetic test on your babies. I have a feeling I might be related to them." Megan, sitting on the bed rocking the twins, froze for a moment at the unusual request. "Why do you think that?" she could only ask, astonished. "You see, I grew up in an orphanage until I was 5, Mark explained, but I hardly remember that period because I was adopted soon after. And these moles, they can only be found in family members." Shocked, Megan agreed to have DNA tests done for the babies, but the results left her utterly bewildered. Mark was indeed closely related to her children. According to the test results, the relationship was very close, even to the level of cousin. Mark hired 2 private detectives to uncover the truth about his childhood. After a month, they provided him with shocking results. It turned out that Mark was the biological brother of the guard who had once wanted to be with Megan. The brothers had been separated many years ago in early childhood due to their negligent mother. The woman decided she could only raise one child and kept Thomas. Mark, on the other hand, had been abandoned at the orphanage by their irresponsible mother, where he grew up until the age of 5 before being adopted by the businessman. Eventually, after Megan returned to the millionaire's home, the young couple decided to try to build their own relationship. It wasn't a sudden burst of passion, but the feelings that developed between them turned out to be very strong and deep. Mark was impressed by Megan's bravery and selflessness and easily saw her as his future wife. Megan was immensely grateful to the man for everything he had done for her and her children. Being their biological uncle, Mark adopted both boys immediately. And after 6 months of wonderful, warm, and respectful relationship, Mark and Megan